Welcome to the City of Talmadge. My name's Dave Klein, the Mayor for the City of Talmadge, and I'm here today to introduce our new zoning code update. We entered into contract with OHM Consultants in January of 2019. In March of 2019, formed a steering committee to help set goals to move us forward. For the rest of that entire year of 2019, we held many public meetings and had a joint work session between all the boards and commissions and City Council. For all of 2020, the steering committee worked countless hours putting the new code together, and now it's time to roll out the code. Very happy about that. Following this introduction, you'll hear from Rick Fay from OHM to go over all the highlights of the code. So again, thank you, and I'd like to recognize Forrest Gibson from OHM and our whole steering committee made up of Megan Raber, Law Director, Helene Hussing in the Zoning Department, Mike Rohr with the Service Department, and myself. So look forward to hearing your input, and here comes the new update.
This is a presentation of the draft Talmadge zoning code. My name is Rick Fay. I'm a planner with OHM Advisors, the lead consultant on the code revision. In this presentation, we'll look at where we are in the project, a summary of the audit of the existing code, and review the public input we've received in various forums to date. Then I'll give a high-level overview of the draft code, its components, and some key details. Again, I'm with OHM. Our consulting partner is Calfee Zoning, and we've been working closely with Talmadge City staff on the production of this draft. We're nearing the end of this project. As you can see, we're in phase 4. Phases 1 and 2 were the initial code audit, interviews, and steering committee work. Phase 3 was extracting the issues observed in the existing code and identifying best practices to arrive at some rough drafts that we worked through with city staff. And we're now in phase 4, testing the draft and refining it. And this is where we're asking for your feedback. After this step, we'll apply any remaining edits and package the code and prepare it for adoption. These are the next steps moving forward. So today, April 7th, this is the draft code presentation. And this is also the day in which the public comment period opens. And so, like I said, we're asking for your questions and comments. And so you can navigate to the webpage at talmadge-ohio.org, where you'll be able to find a link to be able to download the zoning code, the draft zoning code, and there'll be a place where you can add your questions and comments. You can also email questions and comments directly to zoning@talmadge-ohio.org. This public comment period is open now, and it will close at 3 p.m. on April 28th, and that's when we'll compile all the comments and organize them. At that point, there will be a presentation to review responses to the questions and comments, hopefully get some questions answered. There will be a follow-up work session in which we'll gather any remaining feedback. And then it will move on to Planning and Zoning Commission, hopefully on July 1st. That will be the introduction and the scheduling for the rest of the process that will lead it through the council readings, the Planning Commission recommendation, and the final council readings to adoption there at the end of August. We began this project with a code audit, which was a review of the existing code against some overarching principles. And here you see what those are. In general, we believe that zoning should respect existing and reflect desired development patterns. It should be responsive to the context of the community that it's in. Zoning should regulate only what actually needs to be regulated and focus on desired outcomes so that city resources are being applied where they need to be, property owner and developer resources are being applied to where they need to be. And zoning should be the implementation of a plan, not a barrier to a vision. And that's important. And that this is the implementation of the bigger vision that's expressed in the comprehensive plan. And later iterations of that as that continues to evolve in the future. So the code audit reviewed the city's comprehensive plan and extracted from that these benchmark goals. Broaden residential options for all demographics, preserve and enhance the character of the community and the quality of public services, support and promote economic development and regional competitiveness, preserve the city's historical heritage and revitalize Talmadge Circle as an architectural and cultural focal point, and be environmental stewards. Again, the intent of the code is to be used as a tool for implementing the vision. And so the goals that come from that comprehensive plan are key for the update to the zoning code. The code audit then arrived at this overview analysis of the existing code. And so what it found was that limited housing variety, and in fact, a majority of the districts only allow single family with some two-family residential, and multifamily is only available in the R5 district. And there's limited availability to, if any, to do mixed use type developments. And so this specifically gets in the way of that first goal, which was broaden residential options for all demographics. Suburban style design standards throughout the code, and again, a lack of mixed use districts. This results in an automobile centric development pattern throughout the city, large parking fields generally along the street, bigger setbacks, and essentially results in an uncomfortable pedestrian realm. The result is low density, single family, single purpose development, and underutilized areas of development. Fragmented design review and site planning provisions. Throughout the code, there's various provisions for design review, definitions, various things like that. They're scattered in multiple chapters that provides an incomplete picture of the review process and can be frustrating. Minimal open space requirements. There's a minimal open space requirement of 5% set, and this is well below what we see in other communities, and inconsistent with the benchmark goals that we saw in the plan, and inconsistent standards for single family development. The R6 district introduced a more modern best practice in terms of single family development, but the subdivision standards and the other low density residential districts do little to advance the plan's vision moving forward. So with that audit in hand, the following recommendations were proposed. And I'll break these down one by one here, and we can see how we apply them to the draft code. Modernize definitions, permitted uses, and conditional uses as a recommendation. And so you'll see in the draft code that we've prepared land uses into a distinct chapter. They're no longer compiled within the zoning districts. The land uses are spelled out in a matrix, and they include specific use standards. And we've consolidated the land use definitions in an appendix to make it clearer where that information can be found. The next summary recommendation was to expand housing type development opportunities. And so in the draft code, we've introduced a series of overlay districts, which include greater variety of housing options, particularly mixes of uses. We recommended an update to the parking regulations. And so in the draft code, we've updated the minimum parking requirements based on what we've seen in best practice and in other modern codes. We've introduced a maximum parking and shared parking provisions so that there are alternatives to the parking. And we've updated the parking design standards as well. The next recommendation is to create an innovation district. And in this, we've introduced the Employment Innovation Overlay District, and essentially a mixed-use, low-intensity industrial district. And we'll have more on that later on in this presentation. Create a Talmadge Circle District and streamline development review. There is already the Design Control Overlay District, and you'll see in the overlays, we've also introduced a new district called the Neighborhood Center Overlay District that allows a mix of uses, including residential, and incorporates design standards to improve development patterns around the circle. And so the Design Control Overlay District or this Neighborhood Center Overlay District, or potentially other components, other overlays can be used to help address the condition around Talmadge Circle in the future. And the next recommendation was expand the R6 district regulations. Again, seeing that the R6 was introduced with some best practices in mind as it relates to single family. And so in response to this one, our team introduced the planned residence district as a district. Previously in the current code, it's set up as a conditional use, but we brought that up as a district, applied standards to it that are consistent with the R6, and we've consolidated procedures related to those to make it more of a streamlined process. And then again, the other overlay districts provide further development options that go beyond just what the R6 provides. With different development types, mixes of uses, and their potential locations. Next recommendation was to consolidate the administration and procedures. Again, these were scattered throughout various chapters within the code, and so we've created a chapter specific to administration and procedures. And in doing so, we've also looked at other chapters where we've tried to eliminate illegalities as it relates to signage, appeals processes, and reasonable accommodation. So in addition to the code audit, we've also held a series of public input sessions early in the process. We started off with a small group meeting. This is a group of stakeholders and interviews, folks that were knowledgeable about the use of the code, that used it on a regular basis for planning or design or development practices, engineering, that sort of thing. And we got some interesting feedback from them. We heard that the process can sometimes be cumbersome and inconsistent, that there's a need for flexibility for better market adaptability. As the market changes over time, there's a need for flexibility to be able to react to that changing market. They felt that the commissioners could be better trained on the plan and the code in order to better execute it, and that portions of the code sometimes require too much of their interpretation, making that process maybe somewhat frustrating. The application requirements are more cumbersome than necessary. They felt there are opportunities out there to capitalize on the Freedom Trail and industrial and innovation opportunities. Some other interviews that we held with individuals mentioned that the city is fair and enjoyable to work with. There's a need for a more walkable mixed-use environment, reflected in the circle where the pattern is underutilized in particular. They felt that parking should be shareable with further quantity definition. Homes transitioning to businesses, they noted, which could signal a change in character or a change in development pressure. And they noted that the Freedom Trail gets a lot of traffic. And so there's some common themes here among the interviewees in the small group, and some of these comments echo the findings of the code audit and the goals derived from the comprehensive plan. The city also engaged residents in a series of public forums about land use, specifically these items: the accessory structures, animals in urban farming, home occupations, and food trucks. And so we took a close look at how we can incorporate those discussions into this draft code update. Starting with accessory structures, here's what we heard. Generally, the response from the forums was that accessory dwelling units are not desirable. And so in this draft code, they are not permitted. Animal shelters, coops, kennels, stables should be appropriately distanced from adjacent properties. And so in this code, we've applied regulations for setback and requirement for registration when it's appropriate for that use. In the public forum, respondents said that playground equipment and tree houses should not be regulated by the city, but they noted that sometimes the size may exceed what's appropriate for the location. And so in the draft code, we're proposing that structures over 100 square feet will be reviewed as accessory structures, and that gives some leeway to smaller structures, for play structures and tree houses and things that don't necessarily need to be reviewed. But if they get bigger than that, they should be reviewed to make sure that they're consistent with the neighborhood and the context. Vehicle cover storage should be limited to the rear yard, is what we heard. And so in the draft code, they're prohibited from front and side yards, and also the code prohibits temporary structures for vehicle storage. Still with accessory structures, height of accessory structures should not exceed the height of the house. And so in the draft code, they're limited to 20 feet. And existing 900 square foot is a cumulative for accessory structures is sometimes seen as too restrictive for larger lots in the city. And so the new language in the draft code takes a scaled approach to accessory structures, and standards are based on use type and the size of the lot. And so, for example, here, the accessory structures for residential lots under 1 acre, 50% maximum lot coverage of the side and rear yards. They cannot exceed 2,500 square feet cumulative, and that the structures cannot exceed 60% of the gross floor area of the main structure. And so these metrics are tied to the lot in the principal building and the sizes of those, so that there's more flexibility in what is possible for accessory structures on different sizes of lots. And then accessory structures for residential lots more than 1 acre, they are not to exceed 2,500 square foot cumulatively. So there's much more flexibility with those. Also in non-residential districts, they're prohibited in side and rear yards of lots adjacent to residential districts except for carports, and they cannot exceed 2,500 square feet cumulatively. And then other criteria, breezeways will count toward the area of the accessory structure, and accessory structures count toward the total lot coverage when that's being calculated. We heard that setbacks should be defined to better protect adjacent properties. And so in the draft code, Structures that are 200 square feet or less are required a 5-foot setback. If they're over 200 square feet, they have to have the same setback as the principal building, or as specified otherwise by fire code. 10-foot separation from the principal building is required, and lots over 2 acres may be located in front yards. We also heard there was a public forum on animals, which led us to introducing an urban agricultural section in the uses chapter. And so what we heard was a lot of comments about adding provisions for bees, poultry and fowl, and hoofed animals, and that the regulations really needed to address setbacks, noise, and nuisance. And so we've added some uses here to the code. We'll start off with bees, apiculture. Some samples of the standards that you'll find in the code. They must be immovable combs. They're not permitted at attached residential or multifamily uses. There's some quantity restrictions based on the size of the lot, from ½ acre or less up to 5 acres or more. 15-foot setbacks from property lines and rights of way. The entrances of the hives should face the lot line furthest from the hive, so you're lining the approach for bees into the hive away from adjacent homes. They're limited to the rear yard, and they require a certificate of use and compliance. We introduced poultry and fowl as a use. Again, maximum quantities by acreage of the lot. Roosters are not permitted, and they must be confined within a secure outdoor area, and they also require a certificate of use and compliance. And then hoofed animals, ungulates. So this would be your horses, goats, sheep. Again, minimum acreage requirements for or maximum quantities by acreage of the lot, and also requires a certificate of use and compliance. They must also be confined to a secure outdoor space, and then there's some standards related to the enclosure. Some setbacks, 5-foot setback from the property lines. They must be maintained per state health department regulations. They're not permitted to roam outside of the enclosed area. Feed must be stored in rodent-proof containers. Related accessory buildings under 30 square feet are not regulated, but must be located in the rear yard, and fenced enclosures must be 50 feet from any dwelling. Now that's any adjacent dwelling. That's not the dwelling on the property, adjacent properties. We introduced an agroforestry section for forest management, and some standards related to that. 1 acre minimum for the lot size. A forest management plan must be in place. Properties shall not be clear cut, and the tops and the slashes shall not be left within 25 feet of adjacent properties or 50 feet of a public roadway. And then these operations must be in compliance with timber harvesting chapter in part 9 of the city code. Community gardens were added as a use. The conditional use process will review these on a case-by-case basis to determine the need for parking and hours of operation other than dawn to dark. Dawn to dark is the standard, but depending on the context and where a proposed community garden is to be located, these will be looked at more closely for these items. Other restrictions are they must use organic farming techniques. They cannot use mechanized tools. They have to provide on-site trash disposal receptacles, and there can be no on-site produce sales. Planning and Zoning Commission will review these as a conditional use every 12 months. Home occupations was a separate forum, and there was a range of opinions on how these work, the sale of product, number of employees, types of businesses. And so in the draft code, home occupations have been detailed more specifically, and home occupations will need to register with the city. And then food trucks was another public forum, and the comments that we received on that were that they should be prohibited in public rights of way and on public property. And so in the draft code, we've developed a section that speaks to these. They are permitted for private events with the property owner's permission, and a property owner with a food truck on the property must comply with food service regulations. And so that leads us to our code review, our draft code review. So the draft code is broken into these chapters. We call these titles. And these compartmentalize the major elements of the code. And again, I want to take this opportunity to encourage everybody to go to the city website to download the draft code and look at it in its entirety. There's a lot of information in it. Code covers a lot of detail throughout the city. And this review, this presentation today, is really just tip of the iceberg. It's just an overview that we're able to get into. So please go to the city website and take a closer look at the draft and leave your questions and comments. We definitely want to hear your feedback. So the draft code starts off with the table of contents, and with the table of contents, we've included this reference index. And so the way this works is we have the proposed code on the left with the chapter numbers and section numbers in the titles. And then we have on the right, we have the existing code, the similar or comparable section. So if you're familiar with the existing code and there's something particular that you're looking for, you can use this as a cross-reference to maybe help find the comparable version in the proposed code. Anything that does not have an entry in the existing code section here would be a new provision that has been added. And I will point out that some of these sections have been rebuilt, and so they may be closely related by name, but some of these sections have been rebuilt to update and modernize the code. Title 1 is the introduction to the code. It sets the title, the purpose and intent of the code, establishes the interpretation of the standards, introduces a separability clause. This sets the application of districts in cases of annexation, vacations of streets or alleys, and lots divided by a district on the map, on the zoning map, and introduces transitional rules to help define when the old code applies, the existing code, versus the new code once it's adopted. The introduction section also gives the first glimpse of the new overlay districts. So you see it includes all of the existing base zoning districts. The design control overlay district is existing, but then there's a series of new overlay districts that have been added. Now these are floating districts, and they serve as additional standards added on top of the underlying district. So they will be applied on top of a base zoning district. We'll talk more about these further here in the presentation. Title 2 is the administration and procedures chapter. And as I mentioned before, some of these provisions were scattered throughout the existing code. And so a lot of this has been compiled into a single chapter. And so Title 2 defines the roles of various city positions, such as zoning administrator, the BZA, planning commission, Talmadge Heritage Commission, and city council. And it consolidates and aligns the zoning and development review procedures. And so here you see kind of a snapshot of all of the procedures that are pulled into this chapter. And so this is where you'll find your zoning map amendment process, your general and development planning process, public hearing process, that sort of thing. With the various processes related to application reviews, we've taken the approach of trying to clearly indicate the steps of the process. And so you'll see in the draft code that the language says, leads off each step with step 1, step 2, step 3, so that it's easier to read the progression of the steps through the process. And we've used that consistently amongst the different processes so that there's consistency in appearance and approach, which we think will make it easier to use, easier to find information when you need it. We've also eliminated submittal checklist requirements from the code. The checklist will now be maintained separately by zoning staff. And this offers some flexibility so that the requirements can be monitored and more easily updated as needed. And this goes back to the comments that we heard about regulating only what needs to be regulated. And so this allows staff to update submittal requirements to better align with what actually needs to be reviewed. Title 3 is our zones and overlays district. And so this is the chapter that gets into the individual zoning districts specifically. And again, so this is the chart that we saw previously that identifies the base zoning districts that have been carried forward from the existing code, and the overlay districts. Again, planned residence district was formerly a conditional use, but that has migrated to become its own district, which is consistent with what we see in most other communities. And then this chapter details the overlay districts themselves. The districts are built to be illustrated in this matrix format. And so this makes it easier to read than the traditional text format. It provides consistency from district to district. It's presented in a consistent way so that the information is the same, in the same order from one district to the next. So it makes it easier to find the information, to compare the information, to find it when you need it. Overlay districts, again, these are floating districts, so they're not mapped until they are zoned. And so you'll see on the city's zoning map, currently there aren't any overlay districts on them. These are additional standards on top of the underlying zoning districts. They incorporate generally a mix of uses, and the standards are built to emphasize more urban patterns, such as buildings fronting the street, being close to the street, with parking behind. So this map is showing the envisioned focus areas that we used with our steering committee to help us understand how the focus area or how the overlay districts get built, their potential context, where they might go in the city. Now, this is not a zoning map. This was what we used to begin to visualize what these districts could be and how the standards within them could fit within the greater context of the city. The design control overlay district is generally centered around Talmadge Circle. This is intended to be a central business district. It's meant to be a compact, walkable district with rich design details that emphasizes Talmadge's landmark location. Additional residential types add options for young professionals and empty nesters that could enliven the city center and support its businesses. The Innovation Employment District, this is the blue area kind of on the toward the southwest portion of the city, south of West Avenue and east of Britain Road. This is an existing industrial area with a smaller building pattern than you would see in like bigger industrial park districts, that we felt could be well suited to a more mix of uses that could attract more innovative employers and their employees that are seeking amenities that can't be found in more traditional industrial park settings, such as walkability, proximity to a central downtown, complementary service and commercial uses that make it a more interesting place to work. The neighborhood center overlay, these are kind of the purple bubbles that you see. These are envisioned to be concentrated at major intersections of major thoroughfares within the city. And so these could go in a variety of places, not to any one place in particular. These are envisioned to occur at, like I said, major road intersections and natural points of higher activity. And many of these points within the city already are somewhat of a neighborhood center. You've seen that higher intensity commercial activity, maybe historically in some of these locations. This overlay seeks to create these as small neighborhood focused centers that could complement the central business district, but provide a more intimate neighborhood center experience that's maybe a little bit different from the central downtown. These would include a mix of uses, including residential, that help create strong centers and strong neighborhoods. The Southeast Overlay Gateway, this is the area along I-76 at Southeast Avenue. This is a gateway to the city, particularly for visitors coming to the city. And the building pattern should recognize that it's a first impression to the city, to visitors. The standards in place seek to avoid sprawling commercial uses and present a more well-defined street edge with buildings and with the parking behind. And then finally, the West Avenue overlay is this area in yellow, West Avenue, west of Talmadge Circle. This is envisioned to be really a strong business corridor, and the provisions here focus on improving the street frontages, providing a mix of commercial uses to create more vibrancy in that district. And so that, again, that's the snapshot of where the steering committee felt like these tend to concentrate. But again, these are floating districts. They're not defined any place until a property comes in and seeks rezoning to one of the overlay districts. So in the code, the overlay districts are built, again, with consistency in mind from district to district in the way it's laid out. And so you'll see that each includes an intent statement, a description about the applicable development that might utilize the overlay district, a description of the existing and desired development patterns that it may encounter, and a list of permitted building typologies and some character image examples of the potential building types and development character. Each overlay includes a series of diagrams and matrices that illustrate the intended development pattern characteristics, such as setbacks, street frontages, parking locations, and building massing. The list of building topologies that we saw on the previous, a couple slides ago, relate to these building typologies. And these are permitted separately within each overlay district, depending on the envisioned uses and the types of buildings that could go there. The typologies each have an individual sheet that describes each of them. They include a model pattern to suggest how a building might be developed and the components of it, a description of the development, and again, also some character examples. Some of the overlay districts reference what we call a height transition zone. And this diagram shows what that means. The intent of this is in some of these overlay districts, there's an allowance for some taller building heights, but there's also a desire to not have tall buildings that are directly adjacent to maybe smaller residential buildings. So this serves as a transition zone that creates more of a scaled approach to how building heights transition. And so the idea here is that any portion of a building within 30 feet of an adjacent residential district is limited to 2 stories in height. And so that's exclusive of the building setback. But as buildings get closer to adjacent residential, they have to hit that 2-story mark. So they can't just jump up to a higher height. Title IV is our use regulations. And so again, the uses are all compiled in a single chapter. This covers permitted and conditional uses, accessory uses, temporary uses, and use-specific standards. All the uses are compiled in a matrix that allows you to compare different districts, what's permitted, what's not, what's conditional. The use categories are all listed out on the left. There's a reference to use-specific standards where those are applied. P is permitted, C is conditional, A is accessory, and T is temporary. And there's actually an individual accessory and temporary use matrix specific to those types of uses. Uses that are blank in the cells are not permitted. While many of the use-specific standards have been updated, this is kind of a snapshot of some of the more noteworthy additions. Again, the urban agriculture that we touched on as part of the public forum work introduced some definition to kind of agricultural building conversions into event centers, as we've seen that becoming a trend. We've introduced live-work units to the uses, trend particularly in Ohio related to microbrewery, microdistillery, and micro winery establishments. Industrial office, which is intended to be more office oriented, more of a clean, super light industrial application. We're, thinking of things like technology and things like that that might be more integrated in a more traditional commercial setting and not so much an industrial setting. Provided some further definition to a technology park as a use. The fine dining overlay district has been converted to an accessory use related to different establishments. We've introduced standards for renewable energy as accessory uses. And again, the technology park is a use. Title V is the off-street parking section. So this covers parking design standards, special parking requirements, minimum required spaces, and standards related to parking reduction and loading spaces. One of the key items that's been added to this is more definition about lighting standards, and in particular, the use of cutoff or full cutoff fixtures, limiting angled fixtures, prohibiting angled fixtures, and addressing specific levels of uniformity in lighting and foot candle limits beyond the property lines. These are really geared towards overall reducing light pollution. Parking standards include provisions for electric vehicle charging points in larger parking facilities. This is over, parking areas of over 200 spaces. As we see a trend towards more electric vehicle use. Also provisions for bicycle parking, capitalizing on what we've heard about the Freedom Trail being particularly high activity. The minimum parking standards have been updated, rebuilt with some options to further reduce parking in an effort to minimize the amount of underutilized parking in the city. These have been, the parking ratios have also been revisited based on model ordinances that we've seen, new ordinances, new parking codes that we've seen in other communities, and research information provided by the American Planning Association and Urban Land Institute. We've also introduced a maximum parking ratio. 120% of the minimum required is the maximum. And then there's other provisions for further reductions of parking for on-street parking and proximity to public transit. There's also a section related to parking held in reserve, and the concept here is that if you're building new parking, you have the opportunity to provide the physical space for required parking that's designed and the site is engineered and it's ready for it, but it does not have to be immediately built. It's kind of a phased approach. And so if the parking is seen to be needed, then it can be added. But if a particular property owner feels like the code is overparked for their need, there's an opportunity to not have to provide that parking immediately. And then provisions for shared parking, which is a concept that takes advantage of offset peak hour demands by different uses. For instance, a residential user that may be in high demand in the evening, overnight, versus something that is maybe higher in demand during the day, during business hours, when maybe that residential use is in less demand. And so there's an opportunity there to capture some parking that is underutilized by one use for the use by another land use. There's also an opportunity, the code specifies a standard ratio that can be applied, or applicants can submit their own shared parking model for consideration by Planning Commission. Title VI is the landscape and buffering section. This introduces tree preservation, perimeter landscape buffers, foundation planting, parking landscaping, screening, street trees, maintenance in natural landscape areas. A concept that's been introduced here is tree preservation. And so this code protects existing trees that are over 6 inches in diameter at breast height. So that's about 4.5 feet above the ground is where that's measured. The number of inches removed shall be replaced on an inch for inch basis. And so these would be with 2.5 inch caliber trees as a replacement. 40% maximum of the same species in order to limit the amount of monoculture and risk associated with disease and pest susceptibility. And then tree replacement has a fee in lieu of replacement option, where, in cases where replacement would result in overplanting of trees in a particular area, there's the ability for the city to capture a fee in lieu of that replacement, so that that fee can be used towards tree plantings in other locations. The code also includes perimeter buffers, so that there's buffering from higher intensity uses to the lower intensity uses, such as residential. These would be 6 feet in height with an 80% opacity. And then there's some examples illustrated in the code of how that can be applied, either through a wall, through hedge material, or through mounding, if there's space available for that, or a combination thereof. The code details parking landscaping, and so any parking area larger than 20 spaces or 6,000 square feet is required to have parking landscaping, and that includes 1 tree per 10 spaces, 5 square feet of landscape area per 100 square feet of parking lot, and it has to be screened on the perimeter by a 3-foot tall hedge, wall, or mound. Chapter 7 is the open space standards. This defines what is open space, what cannot be counted as open space, such as setbacks. It defines how much of stormwater areas can be counted towards open space, and the design standards, distribution, and ownership requirements. A concept that's been introduced here is related to aggregation and distribution in new neighborhoods. And so when there's an open space requirement, the intent is for the open space to be aggregated as much as possible to create larger, more meaningful, more usable open spaces. While at the same time, we've introduced a provision to distribute open spaces throughout new neighborhoods. And so the idea is, the goal is to get open space within a 5-minute walk to all residences. There's also a fee in lieu of option for this as well, which is subject to Planning Commission approval. And so in a case where, for example, if a new development happens to be directly adjacent to an existing open space, then maybe there's a more practical utilization of open space somewhere else in the city. And so the fee in lieu of can be provided, that can be directed towards providing open space or recreation opportunities elsewhere in the city where it's needed. Chapter 8 is our sign chapter. This has been completely rebuilt. It's been expanded to include different signage types and conditions. We've sought to eliminate content-based definitions. And the format of this chapter includes matrices to help clarify and organize the information, and then there's text descriptions that follow it. And then regulations by sign type. Some of the sign types included here are prohibited signs, signs exempt from permit, temporary signs, which are also exempt from permit, limited duration signs, portable signs, and permanent signage in residential and non-residential zones. Some noteworthy sign standards, temporary signs, these are exempt from permit and apply to both residential and non-residential properties. There are different sizes to accommodate different events warranting a sign, and these are limited to 14 days and up to 4 times a year. There's an exception here for small temporary signs. Now, these would be your more typical yard signs that you see, especially in today's climate where there's a lot of different signs for different causes. These signs would be limited to 4 square feet, up to 2 per property, and there's no time limitation on these. Illumination of temporary signs is prohibited in this code. Portable signs covers sandwich boards, which are popular now for businesses, especially in walkable districts. These have a size limitation, and they must maintain 36 inches of clear walking path on sidewalks. Standards include provisions for a full slate of permanent signs in residential and non-residential districts. And these are broken out by these various categories. And then the chapter includes some illustrations related to sign typology to help provide further definition. Title 9 is the historic regulations. And so this chapter includes the procedures for designating recognized historic structures, applications for removal of the designation, criteria for designating, and criteria for certificate of appropriateness and the procedure and maintenance criteria. A certificate of appropriateness is required for any recognized historic structure or structure in the design control overlay district where there will be an alteration of the existing appearance or a substantial addition to the structure. And so that's the 10% increase of the footprint or more, expansion or addition. Certificate of appropriateness is not required for accessory structures under 200 square feet, deck, patio, or fence, pool, and re-roofing, repainting, re-siding, and those if pre-approved materials and colors are used, pre-approved by the Talmadge Heritage Commission. Title 10 is the city design standards. This includes minor and major subdivision procedures, vacation procedures for streets, alleys, and easements, general standards, public improvements and financial guarantees, riparian setbacks, flood damage control, and control for illicit discharge and illegal connection. And this includes definitions for things like lot types and lot configurations and the orientation of setbacks within those different configurations. And then finally, we've included an appendix, Appendix A, which is a glossary of terms. Again, all the various definitions that have been scattered throughout the existing code have been compiled, coordinated, and placed in this glossary. So it's in a single, easy to find location. And so this glossary is broken into different categories, including rules for construction and interpretation, general definitions, which would be mostly your uses, sign-specific definitions, and then definitions for wireless communication towers, riparian setback, and flood damage reduction. And so that is the overview of the draft code in a nutshell. And like I said, this is just tip of the iceberg for sure. And so please, we encourage you to go to the city website, download the full draft and take a look, and please share your questions and comments. And I'll share those links again with our next steps slide here. Website is talmadge-ohio.org, and questions and comments can be emailed directly to zoning@talmadge-ohio.org. And again, that comment period closes at 3 o'clock on April 28th. So please get your questions and comments in. We definitely appreciate it. And so thank you for joining me, and stay tuned to the city website for those upcoming dates on the next steps. And we look forward to hearing from you and incorporating whatever feedback we can get from you. Thank you for joining me.